If you want to get motivated for success, I can think of no better format than podcasts. Podcasts are fantastic for motivation because you get to listen to inspirational guests that get to share their life story, get to share their struggles along the way, but also get to tell you how they ultimately reached success. Some of those podcasts have become incredibly popular in the last couple of years. For example, the Joe Rogan Experience or the Tim Ferriss Show have millions of listeners right now. But in this video, I plan to focus a little bit more on the lesser known podcasts. You know, the podcasts that are real gems but are not as wildly popular yet. So check out the top 5 motivational podcasts for success. The first podcast on our list is the Jocko podcast. Jocko Willink is a former Navy SEAL turned motivational coach. A few years back, he gave a TED Talk about extreme ownership in difficult situations, which turned wildly popular and made him a star in the motivational speaker scene almost overnight. During his podcast episodes, he talks a lot about discipline, about fitness, about structure in your life, and motivates you to basically get your shit together. And while that might not be exactly original advice, it comes from a guy where you can just sense that he really got his shit together. Jocko Willink is just one of those guys who are extremely confident, extremely dominant, and you can sense that this is grounded in real life experience. Jocko is an expert in conditioning the mind for success. And just listening to him will keep you motivated to keep working towards your goals. So I believe it is an excellent podcast to listen to on a regular basis. Podcast number 2 on this list is How I Built This. It has a completely different premise and setup than the previous podcast, but in its own way it is just as motivational. It focuses on entrepreneurship and building businesses, and the host, Guy Raz, interviews some of the most successful entrepreneurs of our time. That includes people like Patrick and John Collison, the brothers who founded Stripe, Tobias Lütke, the founder of Shopify, or also Casey Neistat, one of the most successful YouTubers. The show is produced by NPR, which guarantees a very high level of quality, and I really enjoy seeing those brilliant minds picked and learn from their successes and failures. I like listening to how I built this when I go for walks outside, and I try putting myself in the shoes of these highly accomplished entrepreneurs. They are truly some of the most successful people alive, and yet they had to struggle so much to get to where they are now. So to me, it is really motivational to hear about the shortcomings that they needed to overcome, the obstacles that they were facing, and the path that they are on. If this is something that sounds cool to you as well, and especially if you are an aspiring entrepreneur, then definitely check out How I Built This. Podcast number 3 on our list is the Tony Robbins podcast. Now, Tony Robbins is already one of the most successful and motivational guys by himself, but now picture him talking to some of the most accomplished people alive right now. As you can imagine, this is the setup for truly inspirational conversations. He talks to people from all walks of life, but they all have one thing in common. They are hugely successful in what they do, and they have a motivational story to tell. Those people are entertainers like Kevin Hart, Olympic champions like Michael Phelps, or outstanding athletes like Conor McGregor, just to name a few here. In my opinion, this is exactly what I want a podcast to be. It should have a host that understands what he's talking about and that I can respect, but most importantly, it should feature a guest that is truly outstanding, truly original, has a fantastic story to tell, and that I want to genuinely learn more about. So if this is what you're looking for right now, then Tony Robbins' podcast is gonna be right up your alley. Alright, we are quickly moving through this list. We are already at podcast number 4, and that place goes to Lewis Howes and the School of Greatness. Now, I have mentioned Lewis Howes and his podcast in a previous video about self-help podcasts already, and if you're interested in that, feel free to check it out right up here. But I wanted to include him in this list as well. And the reason for that is that Lewis seemed to have a special interest in highly successful people, bringing them onto the podcast, deconstructing their approach to things, and then applying that to his own life. And I believe that this is exactly the approach that you need to take in order to become successful yourself. I also really enjoy that he not only talks to people who are successful in the financial sense, but also to people who are just successful in living a good life. That, for example, includes Wim Hof, Simon Sinek, or also Jay Shetty. But then he also talked to sports icons like Mike Tyson and Kobe Bryant. So I believe that by listening to the School of Greatness, you get a good overview of different people being successful in different fields, but all applying the same underlying formula. It's also just really motivational to me to see that these people are real people. They're humans, they have their flaws, they had their struggles that they needed to overcome, and if they can do it, so can you. Lewis Howes, as a former professional football player, can also relate to some of the stories maybe better than other interviewers. So I always have the feeling like there's mutual respect in the room, which to me as a listener of the podcast is hugely important. When I listen to podcasts, I want to be entertained, I want to be motivated, I want to be inspired, but I also want to relax a little bit. So if I get into a situation where the podcast host and the guests are not getting along, then that makes me feel awkward as well. And that is definitely not the case with the School of Greatness. So check it out for yourself. And podcast number 5 on this list of best motivational podcasts for success is Gary Vaynerchuk's podcast. It is called the Gary V Audio Experience, a very long title for a podcast, but you can also find it by just typing in his name on your podcast app. Now I know that Gary V can be a bit polarizing. Some people don't like his very forward attitude, but if you're looking for a very engaged interviewer, then this is exactly the right one for you. As a founder of a multi-million-dollar business and keynote speaker, Gary V definitely knows some things about motivation and success himself, and he brings the right people onto the podcast to expand on that. I also find it really cool that his podcast is not only interviews, but also some of his most popular keynote speeches that he gave. And when Gary V is on stage, he is just overboarding with energy, so I definitely get fired up just listening to him. Another thing that I really like about Gary V is that no matter how direct and sometimes rude he comes off, you always can tell that he truly cares. He tries to motivate his audience, which are mostly aspiring entrepreneurs, but he also doesn't sugarcoat what it means to actually start and run a business. Instead, he gives it to you straight. He tells you it's a lot of hard work, you will not get famous and rich most likely, and in the end, if you do, most people will not even be happy for you, but instead just be jealous. Sounds depressing? Well, maybe, but I believe that this is also very close to reality, much closer than what you usually see on Instagram and YouTube from other entrepreneurs. So if you are looking for a podcast that will not be afraid to tell you the reality of things, and if you want to get a little bit of tough love maybe, check out Gary Vaynerchuk's podcast. And that concludes our list. Do you agree? Did I miss any podcast that you find valuable for motivation and for success? Then please let me know in the comments down below. I'm always happy to widen my horizon. I'm always happy to learn about more resources that I can use on my own path. And if you want to follow that path, make sure to subscribe down below. I'm gonna share more videos about personal development, happiness, and living a good life. And I want you to come along on this journey with me. So that being said, I hope to see you in the next video.